If you're someone new to the whiskey world, or you've been into whiskey for a long time like myself, you've probably heard some crazy things about bourbon over the years. But not everything you hear is true. Today we're going to be unloading the top 5 biggest bourbon myths, and we're going to be busting them. Let's get into it. How are y'all doing today? My name's Chris. Welcome back to Bourbinsane. When I first started my whiskey journey many years ago, I took just about everything I heard about bourbon and whiskey at face value. I didn't take the time to do my own digging, my own research, watch YouTube videos about it. I just kind of heard it and accepted it as truth. Looking back, I wish I had a video like this to where it could have kind of cleared up the mucky waters for me, told me what's true, what's not about bourbon and whiskey. So we put together a list of our top 5 biggest bourbon and whiskey myths. Whether you're someone who's new to whiskey and new to bourbon, or you've been in whiskey and bourbon for a long time, you're going to get something out of this video. If you're new, you may have never heard any of these before. Or you've heard some, but didn't know if it was true, didn't know if it wasn't. Us experienced bourbon drinkers at this point, you've probably heard all these myths before, but I think you can definitely still get something out of 1 or 2 of these. That's for sure. Before we go any further, please do like this video, subscribe to the channel, and we're going to have a fun one today. Let's get into number 5. Let's dive right into myth number 1. Small batch equals better. And honestly, this could be applied to almost every buzzword you'll see in a bourbon or whiskey bottle or label. But today we're going to be talking about small batch specifically. So what is a small batch? It's literally just more than a single barrel. So a single barrel bourbon is just one barrel of bourbon they use to make all those bottles. Could be between 100 and 300 bottles depending on how much they water down the whiskey, things like that. Small batch is when you blend 2 or more barrels together. So it could be 2, it could be 200 barrels. But distilleries on almost every bottle you'll see that's a small batch bourbon, they advertise it that way. Small batch bourbon. Even if they're blending those 200 together, it's not truly a small batch at that point, not in my mind. When I think about small batch, I think 3, 4 barrels maybe. To me, that's a small batch. But who's going to want to buy a bourbon that says large batch bourbon? That just sounds not selective, you know? So it is a buzzword, but just because it's small batch doesn't mean it's better. Honestly, I prefer single barrels quite often myself, especially store-picked single barrels. That being said, there's nothing wrong with small batch if it's done right. You have to find that blender or that distiller that really agrees with your palate, and they have consistency from batch to batch. One of my favorites I always discuss here on this channel is Wild Turkey. I think there's extreme consistency between their small batch bourbon products, which is interesting because their variety of single barrels can be so different with their Kentucky Spirit, Russell's Reserve picks, etc. But as far as small batch goes, it doesn't always mean it's better, but it definitely can. Moving right on to our second myth of the day, color determines the quality of the whiskey. And this is absolutely not true, especially outside the bourbon realm. If you're someone new to your whiskey journey, you probably drink a lot of stuff that's very low proof. Most things that are low proof, they have a lighter color to begin with. Just because something's low proof though, doesn't mean that it's not good, for sure. If you've been in whiskey a while, like me, you tend to lean more towards those barrel proof things probably, or things that are higher proof give you a little more flavor and punch. In general, you are going to get more color that comes through out of your whiskey and bourbon from older expressions, so had more time in wood, more time for that wood to show up into the whiskey itself, and for things that are higher proof, so it's not watered down. Logically, if you water down something, no matter what it be, it's going to get lighter in color. That's also the case with bourbon and whiskey. That being said though, all of our palates are completely different. You may be the type of person that enjoys more of those craft whiskey type profiles, where it's typically younger, typically not as much time in the barrel, so it's going to give off a little more graininess, and not as much color is going to come through. Totally fine. If you like that, more power to you. Moving on out of the bourbon realm though, let's talk about world whiskeys. World whiskeys are actually allowed to add artificial color. So you could put any kind of color you want. It could be a red tinge, more of the dark brown, which is the typical thing to make it look more appealing. So you definitely can't take just what's in the glass by looking at the color. You have to try it for yourself, make sure it's delicious, and if you like it, great. Let's move right on to myth number 3. Whiskey has to be expensive in order for it to taste good. That's not true at all. Of course not. Some of my favorite bottles are budget bottles. The whole Benchmark series, $25 and under. Full proof specifically. You can get 120 proof bourbon for that price. Wild Turkey 101, my daily sipper, $26 out the door in Michigan. And then, of course, Evan Williams Bottled and Bond. How do we go wrong with that one? Whiskey does not have to be expensive, even in this economy and this day and age where everything's marked up and more expensive. I can't get out of McDonald's for less than $25 these days. It's crazy. And I can get a bottle of bourbon for that price. A good bottle of bourbon. So you don't have to spend big bucks. Can you? Absolutely. I have a lot of expensive bottles back here. I do. But I'm a sucker sometimes. And I have a hard time saying no to bourbon. That's okay. That's okay. We're working on it. We're working on ourselves. For me, the sweet spot with bourbon in general is $50 to $60. I think you can get massive, massive quality bottles at that price point. But you can look at half that price, get double the bottles, and enjoy your daily sippers all the time. Moving on to myth number 2. Older bourbon is always better bourbon. Not true. Not true. ADHD whiskey? Matt, don't get mad at me. Sometimes whiskeys and bourbons can be over-oaked. I've had it multiple times on the Elijah Craig 18 year. Because of that, I say over-oaked. When I say that, it means it's more bitter oak. The wood almost turns bitter versus that sweet, creamy, delicious oak you get in a lot of wonderful aged bourbons. Things like your Pappy 15s, I've never had a bad sample. I've never been able to get a bottle. Never had a bad sample. That sweet oak creaminess, and even on the 23, extremely creamy sweet oak. So no issues with those. No issues. But I have been burned on the Elijah Craigs before, and it does reach a point where it's over-oaked, over-aged, and just bitter on the palate. Typically when you get to those 10-year age statements or above, that's when prices tend to skyrocket on the bottles. You can still find a few gems out there, one being the Knob Creek 12-year, still $50 to $60 in most markets, which is pretty much unheard of for a 12-year-old bourbon at this point, and it's actually really good. But just because it's high-aged doesn't mean it's better. It can turn. Not always. There's definitely some deliciously high-aged things. But for me, I think the sweet spot with bourbon is really that 8 to 10 year range for my palate. I could even say 8 to 12 because I do like older stuff. I enjoy that creamy sweet oak that comes through. But around the 8-year age, one of my favorites, Wild Turkey Rare Breed. It's a blend of 8, 10, and 12-year-old bourbons. Always so good, that sweet creaminess, and they have a very nice nutty cinnamon profile that comes through out of Wild Turkey too. I feel like I've mentioned them a few times today. But just because something is super aged and often overpriced doesn't mean you should just pick it up willy-nilly and not look for something else that might be better at that price point. Before we get into our number 1 biggest bourbon myth, please do me a favor and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know what is the biggest bourbon myth you've ever heard in your life. Our number 1 biggest myth about bourbon and whiskey is that all bourbon is made in Kentucky. Not true. Yes, majority of bourbon whiskey is made in Kentucky. Something like 95% or more is made in Kentucky. But at one point or another in almost all of our lives, we've heard that. And definitely as a new whiskey drinker, I absolutely believe that. Because all the big distilleries I knew of at the time, or the bottles I saw on the shelf, they were all from Kentucky. Buffalo Trace, Wild Turkey, Four Roses, all the different Heaven Hills. It's all Kentucky. But we could get into a whole nother rabbit hole talking about Tennessee whiskey. Obviously, not bourbon, but it is bourbon. I'm not going to get into that debate today, so don't get mad at me in the comments. But 2 major distilleries are in Tennessee. You know, Jack Daniel's probably the biggest in the entire world, and then George Dickel. Tennessee whiskey, I know, but yes. It's a little easier to see these days because there's so many different craft companies now than there ever used to be. I feel like 10 years ago, craft whiskey wasn't as popular of a commodity, and nowadays there's craft all over the place. And they are making bourbon expressions. You know, they've had some time to put their barrels down and actually have some of their own juice. Not only that, the biggest company for sourcing whiskey in probably the entire world, MGP. They're in Indiana, and they make bourbon for damn near everybody, damn near every blending company at least. There are still some companies that do source from Kentucky distilleries as well, but MGP out of Indiana, not only do they source for other people, but they have their own label now too. Lots of different expressions under there. So yes, majority of bourbon does come from Kentucky, but not all of it, and there's still some really good ones outside of Kentucky. Alright, well this video was a lot of fun for me to make. I hope you guys enjoyed it and got something out of it. Let me know down in the comments below if you have any other bourbon myths that I should have included or that you've heard before and took as truth. You know, like I said, when I was first starting into it, I took a lot of stuff as truth that I shouldn't have. So if you haven't yet, check out my website, bourbinsane.com. I'm putting out weekly news, reviews, articles, a bunch of cool stuff like this. I actually did a bourbon myths over there as well with a couple different ones. So if you prefer written content, give that a check out. Thank you all so much for being here today. I appreciate you watching this. Stay insane.